The fluorescent lights hummed above the polished floors of Westbridge Corporate Tower, casting sterile white across every corner of the 93rd floor. It was a place where billion-dollar deals were signed with golden pens, where men in tailored suits spoke in numbers that could feed entire villages, and where silence was a luxury reserved only for the most powerful. But on this particular Tuesday evening, in the corner office overlooking the glittering skyline of Chicago, a different kind of silence filled the room. It was the silence of a father watching his son sit motionless by the window, staring at nothing, trapped in a world no amount of money could reach. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Christopher Langford stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, watching his 8-year-old son Nathan rock gently back and forth in his chair. The boy's fingers traced invisible patterns on the glass, his eyes distant, his lips moving without sound. Christopher had tried everything. The best doctors, the most expensive therapists, private schools with specialized programs, behavioral experts flown in from across the globe. And yet, Nathan remained unreachable, locked behind invisible walls that no one seemed able to break through. The office door opened, and Christopher's assistant poked her head in, her expression apologetic. "Mr. Langford, the evening cleaning crew is here. Should I tell them to come back later?" Christopher waved her off without turning around. "No, let them do their job. We'll be leaving soon anyway." He heard the soft shuffle of footsteps, the quiet roll of a cleaning cart, but he paid it no attention. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the meeting from earlier that day when his business partners had suggested, with poorly masked pity, that perhaps Nathan would be better off in a specialized facility. The word they used was care, but Christopher heard what they really meant. They wanted Nathan hidden away, an inconvenience removed from sight. Christopher turned away from the window, rubbing his temples. The weight of the empire he had built pressed down on his shoulders like concrete. Westbridge Industries had made him one of the youngest billionaires in the country, but tonight, standing in his corner office surrounded by awards and accolades, he felt like the poorest man alive. What good was wealth when he couldn't buy his way into his own son's world? The cleaning crew worked quietly in the background. Christopher barely registered their presence until he heard something that made him freeze. It was a sound he hadn't heard in months. Laughter. Not just any laughter, but Nathan's laughter, bright and pure and unmistakably real. Christopher spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. Nathan was no longer at the window. He was standing near the door, his whole face lit up with joy, his hands moving in rapid, excited gestures. And crouched down in front of him, matching every movement with perfect precision, was a man in a gray maintenance uniform. The man's hands moved through the air like birds in flight, fingers forming shapes and patterns that Nathan mirrored with growing enthusiasm. The janitor's face was warm, his smile genuine, his entire focus locked on the boy as if nothing else in the world existed. Christopher stood paralyzed, watching his son engage with another human being in a way he had never seen before. Nathan was communicating. Actually communicating. Through sign language. Christopher's first instinct was anger. Who was this man, and why had no one told him that Nathan knew sign language? But as he watched, the anger dissolved into something else entirely. Confusion. Wonder. And beneath it all, a deep, aching shame. Because in that moment, Christopher realized that he had never once considered that Nathan might need a different language. He had thrown money at the problem, hired experts who spoke in clinical terms and percentages, but he had never simply asked what Nathan needed to be heard. The janitor looked up and saw Christopher watching. He straightened immediately, his hands dropping to his sides, his expression shifting to something guarded and apologetic. "I'm sorry, sir," he said quietly, his voice carrying a slight accent that Christopher couldn't quite place. "I didn't mean to overstep. I just saw your son and I thought maybe he might understand if someone tried to speak his language." Christopher found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "You know sign language." The janitor nodded, glancing down at Nathan, who had gone still again, his moment of brightness fading as quickly as it had appeared. "Yes, sir. I learned it years ago." My daughter, she was born deaf. I learned so I could talk to her. He paused, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. I thought maybe your boy might be feeling the same way she used to feel. Like nobody was really listening. The words hit Christopher like a physical blow. Nobody was really listening. He looked at Nathan, really looked at him, and saw not a problem to be solved or a condition to be managed, but a child desperately trying to be understood in the only way he knew how. Christopher's throat tightened. What's your name? Jake, sir. Jake Martinez. Christopher nodded slowly, his mind racing. Jake, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Can you teach him? Can you help him communicate? Jake's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across his weathered features. He was a man in his early 50s, Christopher guessed, with salt and pepper hair and hands marked by years of hard work. There was something steady about him, something solid that Christopher found himself instinctively trusting. Sir, I'm just a janitor. I'm not a teacher or a therapist or anything like that. I just know how to talk with my hands. That's more than anyone else has been able to do, Christopher said, and he heard the desperation creeping into his own voice. Please. I'll pay you whatever you want. Just help me reach my son. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Jake looked at Nathan, then back at Christopher. Something shifted in his expression, a quiet determination settling over his features. I don't want your money, Mr. Langford. But I'll help your boy. Not because you're paying me, but because every child deserves to be heard. Over the following weeks, something remarkable began to unfold in the Langford household. Christopher had offered to move the lessons to his penthouse apartment in the Gold Coast, a sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows and enough room for Nathan to have his own wing. But Jake had suggested something different. He proposed they meet in the building's maintenance break room on the second floor, a humble space with fluorescent lights, a worn sofa, and a small table scarred by coffee rings and years of use. Christopher had been skeptical at first, but Jake had explained his reasoning with quiet conviction. In my experience, Mr. Langford, kids like Nathan do better when they don't feel the pressure of perfection. Up there in your apartment, everything is expensive and breakable. Down here, he can just be a kid. He can make mistakes. He can be messy. He can be himself. So 3 evenings a week, Christopher found himself descending 91 floors to sit in a maintenance break room that smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old coffee. He watched as Jake worked with Nathan, his patience infinite, his approach gentle but consistent. Jake never talked down to Nathan, never treated him as broken or less than. He simply communicated, hand to hand, heart to heart, building a bridge one sign at a time. Nathan blossomed under Jake's attention. Within 2 weeks, he was signing simple words. Within a month, he was forming complete sentences. But more than that, Nathan was smiling. He was making eye contact. He was reaching out to connect in ways that Christopher had been told might never be possible. And Christopher, sitting on that worn sofa with his expensive suit jacket draped over the armrest, found himself learning right alongside his son. But not everyone in Christopher's world saw this development as positive. His mother, Victoria Langford, arrived one evening unannounced, her designer heels clicking sharply against the marble lobby as she made her way up to Christopher's office. She found him preparing to go downstairs for Nathan's lesson, and her perfectly maintained expression crumpled into disapproval. Christopher, darling, we need to talk about this situation with Nathan, she said, settling into one of his leather chairs without invitation. I've been hearing disturbing things. You're letting the cleaning staff interact with him? Teaching him hand gestures? This is absurd. The boy needs proper medical intervention, not some janitor playing teacher. Christopher felt his jaw tighten. That janitor has done more for Nathan in 4 weeks than every specialist we've hired in 4 years. Victoria waved a dismissive hand, her jewelry catching the light. You're being emotional. I understand you want to help Nathan, but this is embarrassing. What will people think? What will your business partners say when they find out you've got the help raising your son? I don't care what they think, Christopher said, surprised by the steel in his own voice. For the first time since his diagnosis, Nathan is communicating. He's happy. That's all that matters. You're making a mistake, Victoria said, standing and smoothing her skirt. This man is taking advantage of your desperation. He probably wants money or a promotion or God knows what else. People like that always have an angle. Christopher thought of Jake, who had refused every attempt at additional payment, who brought Nathan small gifts he clearly couldn't afford, who stayed late without complaint to work with a child that wasn't his own. You're wrong about him. And I'm done having this conversation. Victoria left in a cloud of expensive perfume and barely concealed fury, but her words lingered like poison in the air. Christopher tried to shake them off, but doubt had a way of creeping in through the smallest cracks. That evening, as he watched Jake work with Nathan, he found himself looking for signs of manipulation, of ulterior motives. But all he saw was a tired man in a maintenance uniform, patiently helping a child find his voice. After the lesson, as Nathan colored at the table, Christopher pulled Jake aside. Can I ask you something personal? Jake nodded, weariness flickering in his eyes. Why are you doing this? Really? My mother thinks you have some kind of agenda. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice was low and heavy with old grief. My daughter's name was Sophia. She died 3 years ago. Car accident. She was 16. He paused, swallowing hard. I spent 16 years learning to talk to her, learning to understand her world. And when she was gone, I thought that part of me died too. All that knowledge, all those signs I learned, they felt useless. Painful, even. Christopher felt his chest tighten. Then I saw your son, Jake continued, and I saw the same loneliness I used to see in Sophia's eyes before we learned to communicate. I saw a kid who was drowning in silence, and I realized that maybe all those signs weren't useless after all. Maybe Sophia taught me her language so that one day I could help another child find theirs. He looked directly at Christopher, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I'm not doing this for money or favors, Mr. Langford. I'm doing this because it's what Sophia would have wanted. I'm doing this because every kid deserves what she had. A parent who learns their language, whatever that language might be. Christopher couldn't speak. He simply nodded, his own throat too tight for words. In that moment, he understood that Jake wasn't just Nathan's teacher. He was a father who had lost everything and was trying to pour his grief into something meaningful. He was a man who understood that true wealth had nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with connection. The months that followed transformed not just Nathan, but the entire Langford household. Christopher insisted that Jake teach him and Nathan's nanny, Maria, and even the household staff. Slowly, the penthouse apartment began to fill with signing hands and genuine communication. Nathan, who had spent years locked in isolation, suddenly had a whole community speaking his language. But the transformation didn't happen in a vacuum, and not everyone in Christopher's circle was ready to accept what they saw as a disruption to the natural order of things. The breaking point came on a cold November evening during the annual Westbridge Industries Charity Gala, held in the Grand Ballroom of the Peninsula Hotel. It was the kind of event where Chicago's elite gathered in their finest attire, where champagne flowed like water, and where million-dollar donations were announced with casual elegance. Christopher had debated bringing Nathan at all. Past attempts at including his son in public events had ended in disaster, with Nathan becoming overwhelmed by the noise and crowds, melting down in ways that drew stares and whispers. But Nathan had been doing so well lately, and Jake had been teaching him signs for managing anxiety and communicating his needs. Christopher wanted to give his son a chance to be part of his world. The evening started well enough. Nathan stayed close to his father's side, wearing a small tailored suit that made him look like a miniature version of Christopher. When the sensory input became too much, Nathan would sign to his father, and Christopher would guide him to a quieter corner until he was ready to return. It was working. They were managing. Christopher felt a swell of pride watching his son navigate a situation that would have been impossible just months before. Then Marcus Webb arrived. Marcus was the chief operating officer of Westbridge Industries, a man who had been with the company since the beginning, and someone who had never hidden his belief that Christopher's devotion to Nathan was a weakness that undermined his leadership. Marcus had been pushing for months to have Christopher step back from day-to-day operations, arguing that the board needed a leader who could give the company his full attention. Marcus approached with his usual entourage of yes-men and social climbers, his smile sharp and his eyes calculating. "Christopher, wonderful event as always. And you brought young Nathan. How brave." The words were complimentary, but the tone carried barbs. Christopher's hand tightened protectively on Nathan's shoulder. "Nathan wanted to be here. He's doing very well." "I'm sure he is," Marcus said, his gaze sliding dismissively over the boy. "Although I have to say, I've been hearing the most peculiar rumors. Something about you hiring the building maintenance staff to provide therapeutic services? Surely that can't be true." The conversation around them began to quiet, heads turning with interest. Christopher felt the familiar weight of judgment settling over the room. "I'm not discussing Nathan's care at a charity gala, Marcus." Of course not," Marcus said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "I'm just concerned, as a friend and colleague. There are protocols, Christopher. Standards. When someone in your position makes unconventional choices, it reflects on all of us. The board has been asking questions." Christopher's jaw clenched. He was about to respond when he felt Nathan's hand tugging at his sleeve. He looked down to see his son signing rapidly, his small face scrunched with concentration. Christopher knelt down to Nathan's level, reading the signs. "Bathroom. Need to go." Christopher nodded and stood, addressing Marcus coolly. "Excuse us." But as they turned to leave, Marcus's voice carried across the suddenly silent space. "You see? This is exactly what I'm talking about. The boy can't even speak. He makes those strange gestures, and you indulge it instead of getting him real help. It's not healthy, Christopher. For him or for you." Christopher froze. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. He turned slowly, his face carefully blank, though rage burned white-hot beneath his composed exterior. "What did you just say?" Marcus had the audacity to look sympathetic. "I'm sorry, but someone needs to say it. That janitor you've been letting spend time with Nathan, he's not qualified. He's not trained. He's filling your son's head with false hope instead of facing reality. Nathan needs professional intervention, not hand-holding from the cleaning crew. And frankly, the optics are terrible. People are talking, Christopher. They're saying you've lost perspective." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Christopher was aware of every eye in the room fixed on them, aware of the phones being subtly raised to capture what was clearly about to become the scandal of the season. He was aware of his mother standing near the bar, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes gleaming with vindication. And most of all, he was aware of Nathan beside him, his son's hand gripping his jacket, small and trusting. Christopher took a breath and made a decision that would change everything. Instead of defending himself, instead of explaining or justifying, he simply knelt down again and signed to Nathan. "Tell everyone what you learned today." Nathan's eyes widened. He looked around at the sea of faces, at the glittering crowd that had never once seen him as anything more than Christopher Langford's damaged son. Christopher could see the fear flickering across Nathan's features, the familiar instinct to retreat into himself. But then something shifted. Nathan straightened his small shoulders, lifted his chin, and began to sign. His hands moved with increasing confidence, forming words and sentences that most people in the room couldn't understand but could clearly recognize as deliberate communication. Nathan signed about his day, about learning new words with Jake, about the story they had read together, about how he felt when people looked at him like he was broken. His face was animated, expressive, alive in ways the crowd had never witnessed. Christopher translated as Nathan signed, his voice steady and clear. "My name is Nathan Christopher Langford. I am 8 years old. I like dinosaurs and space and learning new signs. Mr. Jake is teaching me how to talk with my hands because my mouth doesn't always work the way I want it to. Mr. Jake is patient. Mr. Jake is kind. Mr. Jake understands me. Mr. Jake is not just a janitor. He is my teacher and my friend. The ballroom was absolutely silent. Nathan continued signing, his small hands forming the words with careful precision. Some people think I am stupid because I don't talk like they do. But I am not stupid. I am just different. And different is okay. Mr. Jake taught me that. Christopher's throat tightened as he translated his son's words. He could see tears on several faces in the crowd, could see Marcus's expression shifting from smug superiority to uncomfortable realization. But Nathan wasn't finished. His hands moved again, faster now, more passionate. My dad is learning my language. He practices every day. He is trying so hard to understand me. That makes him the best dad in the world. Better than dads who can hear their kids talk but don't listen. The final sign hung in the air, and then Nathan lowered his hands, his task complete. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, from the back of the room, someone began to clap. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted in applause, genuine and thunderous. People were wiping their eyes, nodding, smiling at Nathan with something that looked remarkably like respect. Marcus Webb stood alone in his circle of embarrassment, his face flushed, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Christopher rose to his full height, keeping one hand on Nathan's shoulder. When he spoke, his voice carried across the room with absolute authority. Marcus, you asked about protocols and standards. Let me tell you about standards. The standard in my house is that we value people based on their character and their heart, not their job title or their bank account. Jake Martinez has given my son something that all your expensive specialists and professional interventionists couldn't provide. He gave him hope. He gave him voice. And he asked for nothing in return except the chance to help a child who needed him. Christopher paused, looking around the room at the faces of Chicago's most powerful and wealthy citizens. I've spent years building this company, accumulating wealth, chasing success. And I was so busy winning in the boardroom that I was losing at home. I was so focused on what I thought Nathan needed that I never stopped to ask what he was actually trying to tell me. It took a janitor, a man most of you have probably never even noticed, to show me that the most important language I could ever learn wasn't Mandarin for business deals or French for international relations. It was my own son's language. He felt Nathan's hand slip into his, small fingers gripping tight. So yes, Marcus, I've made unconventional choices. And I'll keep making them. Because my son is worth more than your approval or the board's comfort or society's expectations. And if that makes me unfit to lead this company, then perhaps this company isn't worth leading. The applause erupted again, even louder this time. Christopher saw his mother standing frozen by the bar, her face unreadable. He saw board members nodding, murmuring to each other with expressions that looked more approving than concerned. He saw Marcus turning and walking away, his humiliation complete. But more importantly, he felt Nathan's hand in his, and when he looked down, his son was smiling up at him with pure joy and pride. Nathan signed one more thing, simple and clear. I love you, Dad. Christopher signed back, his hands steady despite the tears now flowing freely down his face. I love you too, son. So very much. The gala continued, but everything had shifted. People approached Christopher and Nathan throughout the evening, not with pity or awkward sympathy, but with genuine curiosity and respect. They asked about sign language, about Nathan's progress, about how they could learn. Several parents of children with special needs pulled Christopher aside to thank him for speaking out, for showing them that unconventional paths could lead to extraordinary destinations. And through it all, Christopher kept thinking about Jake, who was probably at that very moment cleaning offices on the 93rd floor, unaware that his quiet kindness had just sparked a revolution in one of Chicago's most prestigious ballrooms. The next morning, Christopher arrived at Westbridge Tower earlier than usual. Instead of going up to his office, he rode the elevator down to the second floor and made his way to the maintenance department. He found Jake in the break room, eating a simple breakfast before his shift began, his gray uniform freshly pressed, his lunch packed in a worn cooler. Jake looked up in surprise when Christopher walked in, still wearing his tuxedo from the night before, having come straight from the gala without going home. "Mr. Langford? Is everything okay? Is Nathan all right?" Christopher sat down across from him, suddenly exhausted but also more clear-headed than he had felt in years. "Nathan is perfect. And I owe you an apology." Jake frowned, confused. "An apology? For what?" "For not defending you sooner. For letting people in my life dismiss what you're doing as something less important because of who you are instead of recognizing it for the miracle it is." Christopher ran a hand through his hair. "Last night at the gala, Nathan spoke. Well, he signed. In front of hundreds of people. He told them about you, about what you've taught him, about how you've changed his life. And Jake, I need you to know something. You didn't just teach my son sign language. You taught me how to be his father." Jake's eyes glistened. He looked down at his rough, calloused hands, the hands that scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans and also built bridges between isolated hearts. "I just did what anyone should have done." "But you're the only one who did it," Christopher said. "Everyone else saw a problem. You saw a person. And that made all the difference." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two fathers from completely different worlds connected by their love for children who had needed them in different ways. Finally, Christopher spoke again. "I want to offer you something, and before you refuse, I need you to hear me out." Jake looked wary. "Mr. Langford, I already told you, I don't want your money. It's not money. It's a position. I want to create a new department at Westbridge Industries, focused on accessibility and inclusion. Not just for employees, but for their families. I want to bring in experts in alternative communication, sensory-friendly design, adaptive technologies. And I want you to help lead it. Not because you have credentials or degrees, but because you understand what it means to build bridges between different kinds of minds." Jake stared at him, shock written plainly across his weathered features. "Mr. Langford, I'm a janitor. I clean floors. I don't know anything about running a department or corporate initiatives or any of that. You know the most important thing. You know how to see people who everyone else overlooks. You know how to meet them where they are instead of demanding they meet you where you're comfortable. That's not something you can learn from a textbook." Christopher leaned forward. "I'm not asking you to stop being who you are, Jake. I'm asking you to be who you are on a bigger scale. To help other families find what you helped me and Nathan find." Jake was quiet for a long time, his expression cycling through disbelief, hope, fear, and something that looked like grief. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Sophia would have loved this. She always said I was wasting my talents pushing a mop around. She used to dream about me teaching other people sign language, helping other kids like her." "Then do it for her," Christopher said gently. "Let her legacy be that she taught her father a language of love, and he used it to help others learn the same lesson." Jake wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, not bothering to hide his tears. "Okay. Yes. I'll do it. Not for the title or the office or any of that. But because you're right. Sophia would want this. And because Nathan deserves to grow up in a world where more people understand that different doesn't mean less." Christopher reached across the table and shook Jake's hand, a gesture that carried the weight of gratitude and respect and the beginning of something that would ripple far beyond either of them could imagine. In that moment, in a humble break room that smelled of coffee and cleaning products, two men from opposite ends of the economic spectrum became true partners in a mission that transcended class and privilege and conventional wisdom. The news of Christopher's announcement at the gala spread through Chicago's social circles like wildfire, and by extension, through the business community. The response was overwhelmingly positive, though not without its critics. Some columnists questioned whether Christopher was allowing emotion to cloud his business judgment. Others praised him for using his platform to challenge stigmas around disability and neurodivergence. But the real impact showed up in ways Christopher hadn't anticipated. Parents reached out by the hundreds, sharing their own stories of children who didn't fit conventional molds, who communicated in different ways, who had been dismissed or underestimated. They asked for resources, for guidance, for hope. And Christopher, with Jake's help, began to provide it. The new Department of Accessible Innovation launched 3 months later, with Jake as its Director of Community Engagement. They hired specialists, yes, but they also hired people like Jake, individuals who had lived experience with alternative communication and adaptive needs. They created programs that went beyond just Westbridge Industries, reaching into schools and community centers, providing free sign language classes and resources for families who couldn't afford private interventions. Nathan became the unofficial face of the initiative, though Christopher was careful to protect his son's privacy and never exploit his story. But Nathan wanted to help, signing in videos that went viral, showing other children that their differences could be their strengths. He demonstrated that communication came in many forms, and that being heard didn't always mean being loud. The backlash, when it came, was from an unexpected source. Marcus Webb, who had left Westbridge Industries shortly after the gala, published an op-ed in a major business publication criticizing Christopher's choices. The piece was titled "When Compassion Compromises Competition," and it argued that Christopher had allowed personal circumstances to distort his priorities, turning a Fortune 500 company into what Marcus called a vanity project for disabled advocacy. The article was scathing, suggesting that shareholders should be concerned about a CEO who valued feel-good initiatives over profit margins. It questioned whether Christopher's judgment could be trusted when he elevated a janitor to a director-level position based on emotional connection rather than qualifications. It painted Jake as an opportunist and Christopher as a man in crisis, grasping at meaning in all the wrong places. Christopher read the article in his office late one evening, his jaw tight with anger. His first instinct was to fire back, to defend himself and Jake and everything they had built. But as he sat with his rage, allowing it to cool into something more thoughtful, he realized that Marcus had inadvertently given him an opportunity. The next day, Christopher called a press conference. The room was packed with journalists, cameras, and curious onlookers, all expecting either a defensive rebuttal or a resignation announcement. Instead, Christopher stood at the podium with Jake beside him and Nathan sitting in the front row, and he told a different story. "I've read Marcus Webb's article, and I want to address his central question. Has compassion compromised our competitive edge at Westbridge Industries? The answer is yes. Absolutely yes. And I couldn't be more proud of that fact." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Christopher continued. "For years, we've operated under the assumption that business success and human compassion exist in opposition to each other. That caring about people, truly caring, is somehow incompatible with profit and growth. Marcus's article perfectly embodies that outdated thinking." He pulled up a slide showing Westbridge's quarterly earnings. "Since launching the Department of Accessible Innovation, our employee retention has increased by 40%. Our productivity metrics are at an all-time high. We've attracted top talent who want to work for a company that values people as much as profits. And our public image has never been stronger. So yes, compassion has compromised our old way of competing. It's forced us to compete on values, on innovation, on being the kind of company that people want to be associated with." Christopher gestured to Jake. Marcus questioned Jake Martinez's qualifications to hold a director position. "Let me tell you about Jake's qualifications. He spent 16 years learning a complex language so he could communicate with his daughter. He recognized a need that dozens of trained professionals had missed. He gave his time and knowledge without asking for anything in return. He demonstrated creativity, empathy, patience, and dedication. Those are the qualifications that matter in the department he's helping lead." He paused, making eye contact with several journalists. "But here's what really bothers me about Marcus's critique. It assumes that the only value worth measuring is shareholder value. It assumes that the only intelligence worth recognizing is the kind that comes with Ivy League credentials. It assumes that the only communication worth valuing is the kind that happens in conference rooms and boardrooms. And that assumption is exactly why so many companies fail to innovate, fail to adapt, and ultimately fail. Nathan stood up from his seat and walked to the podium. The room fell silent as the 8-year-old boy climbed the steps and stood beside his father. Christopher knelt down, and Nathan began to sign. Christopher translated, his voice carrying the weight of his son's words. "Mr. Marcus thinks my friend Jake is not smart enough to have an important job. But Jake is the smartest person I know. He is smart in his heart. He is smart in seeing people. He is smart in making people feel like they matter. That is the best kind of smart." The room erupted in applause, but Nathan wasn't finished. His hands continued moving, and Christopher continued translating. "My dad is a good businessman, but he is a better dad because he learned that money cannot buy the most important things. Love is free. Understanding is free. Kindness is free. And those are the things that make life good." Christopher felt tears stinging his eyes as he translated his son's wisdom. Nathan signed one final statement. "I hope one day everyone understands that different kinds of people need different kinds of talking. And when we all learn each other's languages, the whole world gets smarter." The press conference ended with a standing ovation. Videos of Nathan's signing went viral within hours, accumulating millions of views and sparking a national conversation about accessibility, communication, and the narrow definitions society uses to measure intelligence and worth. Marcus Webb's article, meant to damage Christopher's reputation, instead became a catalyst for something much larger. Other companies began reaching out, asking how they could implement similar programs. Universities invited Christopher and Jake to speak. Legislation was proposed to increase funding for alternative communication resources in schools. And through it all, Jake remained exactly who he had always been. He still wore his maintenance uniform on certain days, still insisted on helping with the cleaning when the crew was short-handed, still brought his simple lunch in the same worn cooler. But now, he also gave keynote speeches, consulted with Fortune 500 companies, and helped design accessibility standards that would impact thousands of families. One evening, 6 months after the press conference, Christopher found Jake sitting alone in the old maintenance break room on the second floor. The space had been renovated into a proper conference room for the accessibility department, but they had kept the old sofa and scarred table at Jake's request, reminders of where it all started. Christopher sat down beside him, loosening his tie. "You hiding from the celebration upstairs?" Jake smiled. "Just needed a minute. It's been quite a day." It had indeed been quite a day. The Department of Accessible Innovation had just won a national award for corporate social responsibility, and the office upstairs was filled with people celebrating. But here, in this quiet room where a janitor had first signed to a lonely boy, the two men sat in comfortable silence. "Do you ever regret it?" Christopher asked. "Agreeing to all of this? Your life would be a lot simpler if you just said no." Jake was quiet for a moment, considering. "Simpler, maybe. But not better. Not more meaningful." He looked at Christopher. "After Sophia died, I felt like I was just going through the motions, you know? Getting up, going to work, going home, going to sleep, repeat. I wasn't really living. I was just existing." He gestured around the room. All of this, it gave me a reason to wake up again. It gave Sophia's death some kind of meaning. She taught me a language of love, and now I get to share that language with the world. How could I regret that?" Christopher nodded, understanding completely. "Nathan asked me the other day if he could invite you to his school's family day. Apparently, they're supposed to bring someone important to them who isn't their parents." Jake's eyes widened. "He wants me to come?" "He insists on it. Says you're the most important teacher he's ever had." Christopher smiled. "I told him that was fine with me, as long as you don't mind being mobbed by curious 9-year-olds. "I would be honored," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. They sat together a while longer, two men from different worlds who had been brought together by a child's need and a janitor's compassion. Outside, the celebration continued. But in this room, where transformation had first taken root, there was only quiet gratitude and the unspoken understanding that the most valuable things in life often come from the most unexpected sources. The autumn air carried a crisp bite as Jake stood outside Lincoln Elementary School, watching streams of children pour through the front doors with their family members in tow. He tugged at the collar of his new shirt, uncomfortable in anything that wasn't his usual gray uniform, and wondered for the 100th time if he belonged here. Around him, parents arrived in expensive cars, dressed in business casual attire, carrying professionally wrapped gifts and elaborate presentations for their children's classes. Jake clutched a simple brown paper bag containing homemade cookies his sister had helped him bake the night before, suddenly feeling foolish. A hand grabbed his, small and insistent, and Jake looked down to see Nathan beaming up at him. The boy was practically vibrating with excitement, his free hand already signing rapid-fire questions about whether Jake had brought the photo album they had talked about, whether he remembered which classroom to go to, whether he was nervous. Christopher stood a few steps behind, his expression warm with amusement at his son's enthusiasm. "He's been talking about this all week," Christopher said, using the word talking loosely since Nathan primarily communicated through sign language, with occasional verbal words mixed in when he felt comfortable. "You'd think the president was coming to visit." Jake felt his anxiety ease slightly as Nathan tugged him toward the building, chattering in signs about his classmates and his teacher and how he had already told everyone that his special guest was coming. They navigated the crowded hallways, past bulletin boards covered in student artwork and construction paper turkeys in preparation for Thanksgiving. Nathan's classroom was at the end of the corridor, and as they approached, Jake could hear the excited buzz of children's voices and adult conversation. The moment they entered, the room fell into a curious hush. Mrs. Patterson, Nathan's teacher, looked up from where she was organizing presentation materials, her professional smile firmly in place. Her eyes flickered over Jake, taking in his simple clothing and uncertain posture, and something shifted in her expression. It wasn't quite disappointment, but it was close. Jake had seen that look before, the subtle assessment that placed him in a category marked as less than. "Nathan, wonderful, you're here," Mrs. Patterson said, her tone bright but with an edge that Jake couldn't quite identify. "And this must be your guest." She extended her hand to Jake, her grip brief and perfunctory. "We're so glad you could join us. We have quite an impressive lineup of visitors today. Several doctors, a few lawyers, even a professional athlete. This should be very educational for the children." Jake shook her hand, feeling the weight of her unspoken words. He wasn't impressive. He wasn't educational. He was just a janitor who had been kind to a lonely boy. Nathan seemed oblivious to the undertone, pulling Jake toward a desk near the window where he had set up a small space for their presentation. The boy had created a poster board covered in drawings of hands forming different signs, with labels in his careful 8-year-old handwriting explaining what each one meant. As other families settled in and began their presentations, Jake watched with growing discomfort. A cardiac surgeon talked about saving lives, complete with a 3D model of a human heart. A patent attorney explained intellectual property law using colorful graphics and props. A retired NBA player demonstrated basketball techniques and talked about discipline and training. Each presentation was polished, professional, clearly designed to impress and inspire. And then it was Nathan's turn. The boy stood up, his small frame nearly trembling with nervous energy, and gestured for Jake to join him at the front of the classroom. Jake rose on unsteady legs, acutely aware of every eye in the room fixed on them, measuring, judging, finding them lacking. Nathan began to sign, and Jake translated, his voice quieter than he would have liked. "This is my friend Jake. He is not a doctor or a lawyer or a basketball player. He cleans buildings for his job. Some people think that means he is not important. But they are wrong." A few parents exchanged glances. Jake could feel his face heating with embarrassment, but Nathan continued, his hands moving with increasing confidence. "Before I met Jake, I felt invisible. People looked at me but they did not see me. They heard me make sounds but they did not listen. I felt like I was trapped in a glass box, hitting the walls, and nobody could hear me. Nathan's signs became more emphatic, his young face serious. Jake saw me. He listened. He learned my language when nobody else would try. Jake translated, his throat tight with emotion. Nathan turned to the poster board and began pointing to the different signs he had drawn. Jake taught me that there are many ways to talk. Not just with mouths. With hands. With faces. With hearts. He taught me that being different is not being broken. He taught me that I have a voice, even if it does not sound like other voices. One of the children in the front row raised her hand tentatively. But if you can't talk normal, how do you tell people things? Nathan's face lit up. He began signing rapidly, and Jake translated. I am talking right now. You just need to learn my language. It is not hard. I can teach you. Nathan proceeded to teach the class several basic signs, his enthusiasm infectious. The children leaned forward, their small hands mimicking his movements, giggling when they got it wrong and cheering when they succeeded. Within minutes, the entire classroom was signing hello, thank you, and friend. Even Mrs. Patterson had abandoned her clipboard and was attempting the signs, her earlier coolness replaced by genuine interest. Nathan beamed, clearly in his element, and Jake felt something loosen in his chest. This was why they were here. Not to impress anyone, but to share something real. But then a father in the back row, a man in an expensive suit who had introduced himself earlier as a corporate executive, raised his hand. His expression was skeptical, his tone just barely polite. This is all very heartwarming, but I have to ask, what practical value does this have for children who can speak normally? Isn't this just accommodating a disability rather than encouraging the boy to adapt to the real world? The question hung in the air like a blade. Jake felt anger flash through him, hot and defensive, but before he could respond, Nathan's hands were already moving. The boy's expression had shifted, no longer excited and open, but serious and dignified beyond his years. The real world has all kinds of people in it. People who talk with their mouths. People who talk with their hands. People who talk with computers. People who do not talk at all but still have things to say. Nathan's signs were deliberate, purposeful. When you only know one way to communicate, you miss out on knowing a lot of people. You miss out on their ideas and their stories and their friendship. That is not practical. That is just sad. Jake translated, his voice stronger now, and he saw several parents nodding. The executive opened his mouth to argue, but Nathan wasn't finished. Jake knows 2 languages. English and sign language. That makes him smarter than people who only know English. He can talk to more people. He can understand more of the world. When I grow up, I want to know as many languages as possible. Not because I am broken and need to be fixed. But because the world is big and full of different kinds of people, and I want to know all of them. The classroom erupted in applause, spontaneous and genuine. Children clapped, parents stood, and even Mrs. Patterson was wiping her eyes. The executive sat back in his chair, his skepticism replaced by something that looked like shame. Jake felt Nathan's hand slip into his, small and trusting, and he squeezed gently. After the presentations concluded and families began to mingle over refreshments, Jake found himself surrounded by curious parents and children. They asked questions about sign language, about how he had learned it, about resources for teaching their own children. Several parents mentioned they had relatives who were deaf or had children with speech delays and had never considered sign language as a communication tool. The conversation that had started with skepticism had transformed into genuine interest and appreciation. Christopher stood to the side, watching the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. He caught Jake's eye across the room and signed a simple message. "You are changing minds." Jake signed back. "Nathan is changing minds. I am just the translator." But even as he signed it, Jake knew it wasn't entirely true. Nathan's courage came from the foundation Jake had helped build, the confidence that came from being truly seen and valued. As the event wound down and families began to leave, Mrs. Patterson approached Jake with an expression that was equal parts apologetic and hopeful. "Mr. Martinez, I owe you an apology. When Nathan said he was bringing the janitor who had been helping him, I'm ashamed to admit I made assumptions. Wrong assumptions. Jake appreciated the honesty. It's okay. People make assumptions about janitors all the time. We're supposed to be invisible. Well, you're not invisible anymore, Mrs. Patterson said firmly. And I was wondering if you might consider coming back. Not as a guest, but as a resource. I have 3 other students in my class alone who struggle with traditional communication. One is on the autism spectrum like Nathan, another has selective mutism, and the third has a speech impediment that makes her painfully self-conscious. I think learning sign language could help all of them, and honestly, it could help all the children. Would you be willing to teach a weekly class? Jake hesitated, glancing at Christopher, who nodded encouragingly. I'm not a certified teacher, Mrs. Patterson. I don't have the credentials. You have something better, she replied. You have experience, patience, and genuine care. The credentials can come later if you want them. Right now, I'm asking you to share what you know with children who need it. The school can pay you, of course. It would be a contracted position. Before Jake could respond, Nathan appeared at his elbow, signing frantically. Say yes, say yes, say yes. Please, Jake. My friends need you. Jake looked down at the boy's pleading expression and felt his resistance crumble. All right. Yes. I'll do it. Nathan let out a whoop of joy that was purely verbal, a rare sound that made everyone in the vicinity smile. He threw his arms around Jake's waist, squeezing tight, and Jake rested a hand on the boy's head, overwhelmed by the trust and affection radiating from this child who had once been so isolated. The following weeks brought changes that Jake could never have anticipated. His weekly classes at Lincoln Elementary started small, just Mrs. Patterson's classroom, but word spread quickly. Parents requested that their children be allowed to participate. Other teachers asked if Jake could extend the program to their classes. Within a month, Jake was teaching sign language to over 60 students across 3 grade levels, and the waiting list kept growing. The children took to it with the uninhibited enthusiasm of the young, treating sign language like a secret code they could use to communicate across the playground or during quiet reading time. But more importantly, the 3 students Mrs. Patterson had mentioned began to blossom. The girl with selective mutism, a quiet child named Emma who hadn't spoken in school for 2 years, started signing to express her thoughts. The boy with the speech impediment, Marcus, found relief in a form of communication that didn't make him stumble over words. And Nathan, already progressing well, now had peers who spoke his language, children who could sign with him at recess and lunch. Jake watched these transformations with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since Sophia's death. Each child who learned to sign, each moment of connection that happened through moving hands instead of spoken words, felt like a tribute to his daughter's memory. She had given him this gift, and now he was passing it forward in ways that rippled outward in directions he couldn't predict. But success brought scrutiny, and not all of it was positive. The school district's administration caught wind of the program and sent a representative to observe one of Jake's classes. The woman, a stern administrator named Dr. Helen Briggs, sat in the back of the classroom with a clipboard and a skeptical expression, taking notes as Jake taught the children how to sign about emotions and feelings. After the class, Dr. Briggs requested a meeting with Jake and the school principal, Mr. Robert Chen. They gathered in the principal's small office, the air thick with tension. Dr. Briggs wasted no time getting to her point. Mr. Martinez, while I appreciate your enthusiasm and the children certainly seem engaged, I have serious concerns about this program. You have no teaching certification, no formal training in education or child development, and no background in special education services. You're essentially providing therapeutic intervention without proper credentials, which opens the school district up to significant liability. Jake felt his stomach drop. Mr. Chen, a kind man in his 50s who had been supportive of the program, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Helen, the program has been incredibly beneficial. We've seen measurable improvements in communication and social interaction among the participating students. That may be, Dr. Briggs replied crisply, but beneficial doesn't mean legal or appropriate. What happens if a parent decides we've been providing inadequate services because we used an unqualified instructor? What happens if Mr. Martinez makes a mistake that impacts a child's development? The district cannot take that risk. Jake listened to them debate his worth, his qualifications, his right to do the work that had brought him back to life. He thought about walking away, about returning to the simple anonymity of pushing a mop and emptying trash cans. It would be easier. Safer. But then he thought about Nathan's face when he successfully communicated a complex thought for the first time. He thought about Emma finally expressing herself after years of silence. He thought about Marcus laughing without fear of being mocked for how his words sounded. And he thought about Sophia, who had never let anyone make her feel less than because she communicated differently. Sophia, who had dreamed of a world where everyone could understand each other regardless of how they spoke. Jake straightened in his chair and looked Dr. Briggs directly in the eye. "You're right. I don't have credentials or certifications. I'm not a trained educator. I'm just a father who learned sign language so I could talk to my daughter before she died. But here's what I do have. I have 16 years of experience communicating with someone who the world tried to tell me was disabled and limited. I have the knowledge that came from loving someone enough to learn their language. And I have the willingness to share that knowledge with children who are desperate to be understood." He paused, letting his words settle. "You talk about liability and risk. But what about the risk of telling these children that their way of communicating doesn't matter unless it's done by someone with the right paperwork? What about the liability of teaching them that credentials are more important than compassion?" Dr. Briggs's expression remained unmoved. "This isn't about compassion, Mr. Martinez. This is about professional standards and protecting vulnerable children." "Then let me get the credentials," Jake said, the idea forming even as he spoke it. "Tell me what I need to do, what classes I need to take, what certifications I need to earn. I'll do it. But let me keep teaching while I'm working toward them. Because these kids can't wait for me to collect pieces of paper that say I'm qualified to do what I'm already doing successfully." Mr. Chen leaned forward. "That's actually not an unreasonable compromise, Helen. We could bring Jake on as a paraprofessional while he works towards certification. We provide oversight and support, but we wouldn't lose the momentum of a program that's clearly working." Dr. Briggs pursed her lips, clearly unhappy but unable to find a solid argument against the proposal. "Fine. But I'll be monitoring this closely. Any complaints, any concerns, any hint that this arrangement isn't serving the children's best interests, and the program ends immediately. Are we clear?" Jake nodded, relief and determination mingling in his chest. "Crystal clear." As he left the meeting, Jake pulled out his phone and called Christopher, explaining what had happened and what he had committed to doing. Christopher listened quietly, then said, "What do you need?" "Time, mostly," Jake admitted. "I'll need to take classes, probably in the evenings and weekends. I'll need to study for certification exams. And I'll probably need help navigating the bureaucracy because I have no idea where to even start." "Consider it done," Christopher said without hesitation. "I'll have my assistant research the requirements and set up a meeting with an education consultant. And Jake? I'm proud of you for fighting for this. A lot of people would have walked away." Jake thought about that as he drove home that evening. Walking away would have been easier. But easy had the community college classroom smelled of old textbooks and industrial cleaner, a scent that Jake found oddly comforting given his years working maintenance. He sat in the back row of Introduction to Educational Psychology, surrounded by students half his age who typed notes on laptops while he scribbled in a spiral notebook with calloused hands more accustomed to holding mops than pens. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Professor Angela Morrison droned on about developmental stages and learning theories, and Jake fought to keep his eyes open after finishing a full shift at Westbridge Tower just 2 hours earlier. His phone buzzed silently in his pocket. He pulled it out carefully, glancing at the screen under the desk. A text from Nathan, sent via Christopher's phone since the boy was too young for his own device. The message contained a photo of Nathan holding up a math test with a bright red A- at the top, his smile radiant, his hands forming the sign for proud. Jake felt warmth spread through his chest despite his exhaustion. He quickly typed back a response, his thick fingers clumsy on the small keyboard, telling Nathan how incredible he was doing and that they would celebrate at their next lesson. Professor Morrison's voice cut through his moment of distraction. "Mr. Martinez, since you seem more interested in your phone than my lecture, perhaps you'd like to share with the class what's so important?" Jake looked up to find every eye in the classroom turned toward him. Heat crept up his neck, the familiar shame of being called out, of being made to feel like he didn't belong. He could have apologized, could have mumbled an excuse and slunk down in his seat. Instead, he held up his phone, showing the photo of Nathan and his test. "I was checking in with one of my students," Jake said evenly. "He's 8 years old, on the autism spectrum, and he just got his first A- in math. A year ago, he couldn't communicate with anyone at school. Now he's thriving." "So yes, Professor, it was important." The classroom fell silent. Professor Morrison's expression shifted from irritation to something more complex. She walked down the aisle toward Jake's desk, her heels clicking against the linoleum. When she reached him, she held out her hand. "May I?" Jake handed her the phone. She studied the photo, her face softening. "He communicates through sign language?" "Primarily, yes. Along with some verbal communication when he's comfortable." Professor Morrison handed back the phone and turned to address the class. "This, everyone, is why we're here. Not to memorize theories from textbooks, but to understand that education is about reaching every child, regardless of how they learn or communicate. Mr. Martinez is demonstrating applied learning while the rest of you are still in the theoretical stage." She looked at Jake with new respect. "I apologize for my tone. Tell me more about your work with this student." Jake found himself explaining his journey with Nathan, about learning sign language for his daughter Sophia, about recognizing a lonely boy who needed someone to speak his language. He talked about the program at Lincoln Elementary, about the children who were finding their voices through alternative communication. As he spoke, he watched the other students lean forward with genuine interest, saw them taking notes not because it would be on the exam, but because it mattered. When class ended, several students approached Jake with questions. A young woman named Rebecca mentioned that her younger brother had developmental delays and asked for resources on sign language. A man named David, probably in his late 20s, admitted he was considering special education as a career path and wanted to know more about Jake's approach. Professor Morrison waited until the others had dispersed before pulling Jake aside. "I looked you up after the gala incident went viral," she admitted. "The video of that little boy signing at the charity event has over 20 million views. You're becoming something of a phenomenon in education circles." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just trying to help some kids." "You're doing more than that," Professor Morrison said firmly. "You're challenging the entire system to reconsider how we define expertise and who we trust to educate our children. But I have to warn you, the system doesn't like being challenged. You're going to face resistance, probably more than you already have. The credentials you're working toward will help, but they won't eliminate the prejudice you'll encounter from people who believe that real knowledge only comes from traditional academic paths." "So what do I do?" Jake asked, suddenly feeling the weight of everything he had taken on. "You keep showing up," Professor Morrison said. "You keep proving them wrong with results instead of rhetoric. And you remember that every educator who ever changed the field did so by refusing to accept that things had to stay the way they'd always been." She paused, then added, "Also, you might want to move to the front of the classroom. Easier to stay awake during my lectures." Jake left campus that night with his head spinning from information overload and his body aching from exhaustion, but he also left with something else. A sense that he was part of something larger than himself, that his journey wasn't just about getting credentials but about proving that wisdom could come from unexpected places and that the most valuable teachers were often those who had learned their lessons through lived experience rather than textbook study. The weeks blurred into a relentless rhythm of work, study, and teaching. Jake would start his mornings at 4, arriving at Westbridge Tower to complete his maintenance duties before the building filled with employees. Christopher had offered repeatedly to relieve him of those responsibilities, to let him focus entirely on his educational pursuits, but Jake had refused. The maintenance work grounded him, reminded him where he came from, kept him humble. Besides, he had worked alongside the other members of the cleaning crew for years. They were his friends, his community, and he wasn't about to abandon them just because his circumstances had changed. By 8 in the morning, he would transition to his role at the Department of Accessible Innovation, meeting with families, consulting on communication strategies, developing programs. 3 afternoons a week, he taught at Lincoln Elementary, where his classes had expanded to include not just sign language but also lessons on empathy, diversity, and understanding different forms of intelligence. Evenings were dedicated to his college courses, and late nights were spent studying, his kitchen table covered in textbooks and notes, a cold cup of coffee always within reach. His sister Maria watched his transformation with a mixture of pride and concern. She would call him most evenings, checking that he was eating properly, sleeping enough, not pushing himself too hard. "You're not a young man anymore, Jake," she would remind him gently. "You need to take care of yourself." But Jake couldn't slow down. Every day brought new opportunities, new children who needed help, new families desperate for guidance. A mother whose autistic daughter had been expelled from 3 schools for behavioral issues reached out after seeing Nathan's video. Jake worked with the girl, teaching her to sign her frustrations instead of lashing out physically, and within weeks she was back in school and succeeding. A father whose son had selective mutism found Jake's contact information through the Westbridge Accessibility Program. Jake spent months building trust with the boy, never forcing speech, simply offering alternative ways to communicate, until the day the child spoke his first words in 2 years. Each success felt like a validation, proof that his unconventional path had value. But each success also brought more attention, more scrutiny, and more people questioning whether someone without traditional credentials should be wielding such influence over vulnerable children. The breaking point came during a school board meeting 6 months into Jake's certification journey. Lincoln Elementary had submitted a proposal to expand a sign language program district-wide, creating a standardized curriculum that could be implemented in every elementary school. The proposal included Jake as the lead curriculum developer and primary trainer for teachers who would implement the program. Jake sat in the audience of the packed auditorium, watching as the school board members reviewed the proposal. Mr. Chen presented the data, showing measurable improvements in communication skills, social integration, and academic performance among students who had participated in the program. He showed testimonials from parents, from teachers, from the students themselves. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. But when the floor opened for public comment, the opposition emerged with a vengeance. A woman named Patricia Holbrook, who identified herself as a parent and concerned taxpayer, approached the microphone with a prepared statement. Her voice was sharp, her words calculated to sting. "I have nothing against Mr. Martinez personally," she began, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I'm sure he's a very nice man who means well. But let's be honest about what this proposal really represents. We're asking the district to invest significant resources into a program developed by a janitor. Not an educator. Not a licensed therapist. A janitor." Jake felt the familiar flush of humiliation creep up his neck, but he forced himself to remain still, to listen. Patricia continued, gaining momentum. "My children deserve to be taught by qualified professionals, people who have dedicated years to studying child development and educational best practices. This proposal sets a dangerous precedent that anyone with a compelling personal story can override years of professional training and expertise. Where does it end? Do we start letting construction workers teach physics because they understand structural engineering? Do we let cashiers teach economics because they handle money?" Several people in the audience murmured agreement. Jake saw Dr. Briggs in the front row, her expression neutral but her posture suggesting satisfaction. This was exactly what she had warned would happen. Another parent stood to speak, a man named Gregory Walsh who was a surgeon at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Furthermore, Gregory said, adjusting his glasses, while the short-term results may appear positive, we have no way of knowing the long-term impact of this program. These children are being used as guinea pigs in an unproven educational experiment. As a medical professional, I would never implement a treatment protocol without rigorous testing and peer review. Why are we holding education to a lower standard? Jake watched as Mr. Chen tried to counter these arguments, pointing out that the program had been carefully monitored, that students had shown documented improvement, that the approach was based on established principles of alternative communication. But the board members looked uncertain, swayed by the professional credentials and polished rhetoric of the opposition. Then Nathan stood up. Christopher was seated beside him, and Jake saw the father's hand move to stop his son, but Nathan was already walking toward the microphone with determined steps. At 8 years old, he was small enough that someone had to lower the microphone stand for him. He stood there for a moment, looking out at the sea of adult faces, and Jake could see the fear flickering across the boy's features. But Nathan took a deep breath and began to sign. Christopher stood and moved to translate, but Nathan shook his head. Instead, he spoke aloud, his words careful and deliberate, fighting against the communication challenges that made verbal speech difficult for him. My name is Nathan Langford. I am 8. I want to talk about Mr. Jake. The auditorium fell silent. Nathan's voice was quiet but clear, each word precisely formed with obvious effort. Before Mr. Jake, nobody understood me. I was alone inside my head. Screaming and nobody could hear. It hurt. Every day hurt. I thought I was stupid. I thought something was wrong with me that could not be fixed. Jake felt tears burning in his eyes. He had never heard Nathan articulate his experience so clearly, had never realized the depth of pain the boy had carried. Mr. Jake saw me, Nathan continued, his hands occasionally forming signs when the words got stuck. Not broken Nathan. Not problem Nathan. Just Nathan. He learned my language. He taught me I was smart. He taught me I had value. He saved my life. Patricia Holbrook stood up, her face flushed. Board members, this is emotional manipulation. This child has clearly been coached, I am not coached. Nathan's voice rose, stronger now, anger giving him power over his speech impediment. I am not stupid. I am not a liar. I am telling truth. Mr. Jake has no fancy papers. But he has something better. He has a heart that sees people. He has patience. He has love. The doctors with papers did not help me. The therapists with certificates did not help me. Mr. Jake helped me. And he will help other kids like me if you let him. Nathan's hands moved in rapid sign language, and this time Christopher did translate, his voice thick with emotion. My son says that maybe the problem isn't that Jake doesn't have the right credentials. Maybe the problem is that we credential the wrong things. We give certificates for memorizing books but not for understanding hearts. We give degrees for test scores but not for compassion. We validate people who look right and talk right and come from the right backgrounds, and we ignore people who might not have papers but have something more important. They have wisdom earned through suffering and love earned through sacrifice. The auditorium erupted. Some people were applauding, others were shouting objections, and the school board president was banging his gavel trying to restore order. But Jake only had eyes for Nathan, this small, brave boy who had found his voice and was using it to defend the man who had helped him find it. The board called for a recess to deliberate. Jake slipped outside, needing air, needing space to process what had just happened. He found himself in the parking lot, leaning against his old pickup truck, staring up at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. He thought about Sophia, about whether she could see him now, whether she was proud of what he was doing with the language she had taught him to speak. Christopher found him there, Nathan's hand firmly clasped in his own. The boy ran to Jake and wrapped his arms around his waist, pressing his face against Jake's worn jacket. Jake held him, this child who had become so precious to him, and let himself feel the weight of love and responsibility. Whatever the board decides, Christopher said quietly, you need to know that you've already succeeded. You've changed lives. You've challenged a broken system. You've shown people that expertise isn't always found where they expect to find it. That matters, Jake. Regardless of what happens in there, that will always matter. Jake nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. They stood together in the parking lot, an unlikely family bound not by blood but by shared struggle and mutual respect, waiting for a group of strangers to decide the fate of something that had already proven its worth in the most important ways. After 30 minutes that felt like hours, they were called back inside. The auditorium was still packed, the tension palpable as the board president cleared his throat and began to speak. The board has carefully considered the proposal for district-wide implementation of the sign language program, as well as the concerns raised by community members. We recognize that this is an unconventional situation requiring an unconventional approach. Jake braced himself for rejection, for polite words that would ultimately mean his work at Lincoln Elementary would end once he failed to complete his credentials in time. Therefore, the president continued, the board has voted to approve the pilot program expansion with the following conditions. Mr. Martinez will continue his work toward full certification, which he must complete within 18 months. During that time, he will work under the supervision of licensed special education professionals who will monitor program implementation and student outcomes. Additionally, we will require quarterly reviews of the program's effectiveness, with the understanding that if student outcomes decline or concerns arise, the program may be suspended or modified. Jake's head spun. They were saying yes. With conditions and oversight and skepticism, but yes. He looked at Nathan, who was bouncing with excitement, his hands forming the sign for victory over and over. He looked at Mr. Chen, who was beaming with relief. He looked at Christopher, whose eyes were bright with unshed tears. But most importantly, he looked at the faces of the parents scattered throughout the audience, parents of children who communicated differently, who learned differently, who had been told their children would never thrive in traditional educational settings. Those parents were crying, hugging each other, holding their children close with expressions of hope that Jake recognized because he had worn that same expression when Sophia was alive and fighting to be understood in a world that didn't speak her language. Patricia Holbrook gathered her things and left in a huff, several like-minded parents following her. Dr. Briggs remained seated, her expression unreadable but not hostile. Jake suspected she would indeed be watching him carefully, waiting for any misstep. But he also suspected that beneath her bureaucratic caution, she understood what this program meant for children who had been underserved by traditional approaches. As the meeting adjourned and people began to file out, a line formed near Jake. Parents wanting information, teachers wanting to volunteer, community members wanting to help. Jake answered questions, shared contact information, accepted tearful hugs from mothers and firm handshakes from fathers. He felt overwhelmed and exhausted and more alive than he had felt in years. Late that night, back in his small apartment, Jake sat at his kitchen table with his textbooks spread before him. He had a developmental psychology exam in the morning and at least 3 chapters to review. His body ached, his eyes burned with fatigue, and his head pounded from the emotional intensity of the evening. But on his refrigerator, held in place by a magnet shaped like a heart, was a drawing Nathan had made for him weeks ago. It showed 2 stick figures holding hands, one tall and one small, with a rainbow of colors arching over their heads. In careful block letters, Nathan had written, "Mr. Jake is my hero." Jake looked at that drawing, thought about all the children whose lives might change because of a program that almost didn't happen, and opened his textbook. The path ahead would be difficult. The skeptics would be watching for him to fail. The workload would be crushing. The standards would be high and the margin for error non-existent. But some things were worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, worth pouring every ounce of energy and determination into achieving. Sophia had taught him that lesson when she fought every day to communicate in a world that wasn't designed for her. Nathan was teaching him that lesson now, showing him that courage could come in small packages and that sometimes the most important victories were the ones that happen one child, one family, one changed mind at a time. Jake picked up his highlighter and began to read, his lips moving silently as he absorbed information about cognitive development and learning disabilities and educational interventions. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. A neighbor's television played too loud. The refrigerator hummed its familiar song. And a janitor who had been dismissed as unqualified studied late into the night, preparing to prove that expertise could be earned in classrooms, but wisdom was forged in the crucible of love and loss, and the determination to ensure that no child would ever again feel as invisible as his daughter once had, or as isolated as Nathan had been before someone finally learned to speak his language. Never been the point. The point was building something that mattered, something that honored Sophia's memory and helped children like Nathan find their voices. If that meant going back to school at 53 years old, if that meant studying late into the night after long days of work, then that's what he would do. Because some things were worth fighting for, even when the world questioned your right to fight. 18 months passed like water through cupped hands, each day bleeding into the next in a blur of classrooms, children, and late-night study sessions. Jake stood now in the administrative offices of Chicago Public Schools, holding a certificate that bore his name in elegant calligraphy, Certified Educational Specialist in Alternative Communication. His hands trembled slightly as he stared at the document, this piece of paper that had cost him countless sleepless nights, gallons of coffee, and more determination than he knew he possessed. Professor Morrison stood beside him, her smile warm and genuine. She had become more than an instructor over the months, transforming into a mentor and advocate who had guided him through the bureaucratic maze of certification requirements. "You earn this, Jake." Every word of it. But Jake barely heard her. His mind was elsewhere, traveling back to a hospital room 3 years ago where Sophia had taken her last breath, her small hand forming one final sign in his. "I love you, Daddy." He had promised her then, through his grief and anguish, that her life would mean something beyond the years she had been given. And now, holding this certificate, he felt he was finally keeping that promise. The celebration that evening was held not in some fancy restaurant or hotel ballroom, but in the maintenance break room on the second floor of Westbridge Tower, the same humble space where Jake had first signed to Nathan. Christopher had insisted despite Jake's protests, arguing that this was where the journey had truly begun and where it should be honored. The room had been transformed with colorful decorations, a table laden with food, and walls covered in artwork created by the children Jake had taught over the past year and a half. Nathan was the first to arrive, bursting through the door with barely contained excitement, his hands already signing congratulations before he even reached Jake. The boy had grown in the months since the school board meeting, not just physically but in confidence and capability. He was mainstreamed now in a regular fourth-grade classroom, thriving academically and socially, serving as a bridge between hearing students and those who communicated differently. "Look what I made for you," Nathan signed, pulling a framed photograph from his backpack. It showed Jake and Nathan together at Lincoln Elementary, surrounded by a dozen children all forming different signs with their hands. Someone had captured the moment perfectly, the joy and connection visible on every face. Beneath the photo, Nathan had written in his improving handwriting, "Family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who see you when you're invisible." Jake accepted the gift with hands that shook, his vision blurring with tears he no longer tried to hide. "Thank you, Nathan. This means more to me than any certificate." "The certificate is important too," Nathan signed back, his expression serious. "Because now nobody can say you're not qualified. Now they have to listen." Christopher arrived next, accompanied by Maria and several members of the Westbridge accessibility team. Then came Mr. Chen and Mrs. Patterson from Lincoln Elementary, followed by Professor Morrison and several of Jake's former classmates. Emma, the girl with selective mutism, arrived with her mother, both of them signing greetings. Marcus, whose speech impediment had made school a nightmare, brought his father and immediately began telling Jake about his plans to become a speech therapist himself someday. As the room filled with people whose lives had intersected with Jake's journey, he found himself overwhelmed by the realization of how far ripples could travel from a single act of kindness. He had simply seen a lonely boy and offered to help. Everything else had grown from that one moment of connection. Dr. Helen Briggs appeared in the doorway, and the room quieted slightly. She had been Jake's most persistent skeptic, the administrator who had questioned every aspect of his work, who had required quarterly reviews and constant documentation. Jake had expected her to remain distant, professionally courteous but never warm. But she crossed the room with purpose and extended her hand to him. "Mr. Martinez, I owe you an apology," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent space. "When you first started this program, I was convinced it would fail. I believed that good intentions without proper credentials were a recipe for disaster. I watched you carefully, waiting for you to prove me right." Jake shook her hand, uncertain where this was leading. "Instead," Dr. Briggs continued, "you proved me wrong in the most spectacular way possible. Not only have your students shown remarkable progress, but you've inspired a shift in how we think about expertise and who we trust to educate our children. The data from your program has been so compelling that 3 other school districts have reached out asking to implement similar initiatives. You've changed the landscape of special education in this city, Mr. Martinez. And you did it by refusing to accept that credentials mattered more than compassion." She paused, and Jake saw something unexpected in her eyes. Respect. "I've spent 30 years in education administration, and I've never seen anyone fight as hard as you have to reach children that others had given up on. You've reminded me why I got into this field in the first place. So thank you. And congratulations on your well-deserved certification." The room erupted in applause. Jake felt Christopher's hand on his shoulder, felt Nathan pressed against his side, and allowed himself to accept what he had accomplished. Not for himself, but for Sophia, whose legacy now lived in every child who found their voice through the language she had taught him. The evening wore on with food and laughter and stories. Parents shared testimonials about their children's transformations. Teachers discussed how learning sign language had changed their entire approach to classroom communication. Students performed a signing choir rendition of a popular song, their hands moving in synchronized beauty that brought tears to many eyes. But the most powerful moment came near the end of the evening when Christopher asked for everyone's attention. He stood with Nathan beside him, and Jake noticed they were both holding prepared remarks, Nathan's written in large print with sign language notations. "When my son was diagnosed on the autism spectrum," Christopher began, his voice steady but emotional, "I threw money at the problem. I hired the best specialists, enrolled him in exclusive programs, sought out cutting-edge treatments. I believed that wealth could buy solutions to any challenge. And I was wrong." He looked at Jake. What Nathan needed wasn't expensive. It wasn't exclusive. It wasn't even particularly complicated. He needed someone to see him as a complete person rather than a collection of deficits. He needed someone willing to learn his language instead of forcing him to adapt to theirs. He needed someone who valued connection more than credentials. Christopher's hand moved to Nathan's shoulder. "Jake gave us that. But more than that, he taught me what it means to be Nathan's father. He showed me that the greatest gift I could give my son wasn't a trust fund or prestigious schools. It was my time, my attention, my willingness to step into Nathan's world instead of demanding he conform to mine." Nathan stepped forward then, his small hands beginning to sign while Christopher translated. "Mr. Jake, you told me once that your daughter Sophia taught you how to speak with your hands so you could talk to her heart. You taught me the same thing. But you also taught me something else. You taught me that being different is not being broken. That my voice matters even if it sounds different from other voices. That I have value exactly as I am." The boy paused, took a breath, and continued signing. "You came into my life when I was drowning in loneliness. You threw me a rope made of patience and kindness and understanding. You pulled me to safety. And then you taught me to swim so I could help other kids who were drowning too." Nathan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. He opened it to reveal a silver medal hanging from a blue ribbon. On one side was engraved an image of 2 hands forming the sign for love. On the other side were the words, "Sophia's legacy in honor of those who teach us to speak from the heart." "My dad and I created an award," Nathan signed, his face glowing with pride. "We are giving it to people who help kids like me find their voices. You are the first person to get it. Because you are the reason it exists." Jake accepted the medal with hands that shook, his throat too tight for words. He fastened it around his neck, feeling the weight of it settle against his chest, right over his heart. When he finally found his voice, it came out rough and broken. Sophia would have loved you, Nathan. She would have been so proud of the young man you're becoming. And she would have been honored to have her name attached to something that helps other children. He looked around the room at all the faces watching him, people from every part of his life, united in this moment of celebration. I'm not a hero. I'm just a father who lost his daughter and found a purpose in making sure her struggle meant something. Every child I've helped, every family I've supported, it's all been because Sophia taught me that love finds a way to communicate even when words fail. She taught me that patience is more powerful than pressure, that acceptance is more healing than correction, and that sometimes the people who need the most help are the ones everybody else has stopped seeing. Jake's voice strengthened. I was invisible for most of my life. Just a janitor. Just someone who cleaned up other people's messes. And then I met Nathan, and Christopher, and all of you. And you taught me that invisible doesn't mean insignificant. That quiet work can have loud impact. That the most important changes often start in the smallest moments between two people who choose to see each other's humanity. He touched the medal at his chest. This belongs to all of us. To every parent who refuses to give up on their child. To every teacher who learns their students' languages instead of forcing conformity. To every person who chooses compassion over credentials, connection over convention. We're building something together, something bigger than any one of us. And it started because one lonely boy needed someone to speak his language, and one broken father needed to believe that his daughter's life had mattered. The evening ended with embraces and promises to stay connected, with children running and laughing through the maintenance break room that had become something sacred. As people filtered out, Jake found himself alone with Christopher and Nathan for a quiet moment. What happens now? Christopher asked. You've got your certification, the program is expanding, you've got more opportunities than you can possibly pursue. What's next for Jake Martinez? Jake looked at Nathan, then at the drawings covering the walls, then at the medal around his neck. I keep showing up. I keep learning. I keep helping kids find their voices. Because that's what Sophia would want. That's what these children deserve. And honestly, that's what brings me peace. Nathan signed a question, his young face curious. Do you still miss her? Your daughter? Jake knelt down to Nathan's level, his eyes meeting the boy's without flinching from the truth. Every single day. But you know what? The missing hurts less now because I can see her living on in all the children I help. She's in every sign I teach, every connection I help build, every moment when a child who felt invisible suddenly feels seen. Sophia's not gone. She's just speaking through different hands now. Nathan threw his arms around Jake's neck, and Jake held him close, this child who had saved him as much as he had saved the child. Christopher joined the embrace, and the three of them stood together in the humble break room, a family forged not by blood but by shared struggle and mutual love. Months later, Jake stood in front of a packed auditorium at a national education conference, preparing to give a keynote address about alternative communication and inclusive education. He wore his maintenance uniform, a deliberate choice that had raised eyebrows among the conference organizers. But Jake had insisted. The uniform was part of his story, part of who he was, and he refused to hide it for the comfort of others. As he looked out at the sea of educators, administrators, and specialists, he thought about how far he had come from that first evening when he had simply signed hello to a lonely boy. He thought about Sophia, about Nathan, about all the children whose lives had changed because someone chose to speak their language. And then Jake began to sign, his hands moving with practiced grace, telling a story that started with loss and ended with hope, demonstrating that the most powerful teaching tool was not a curriculum or a credential but simply the willingness to see another person's humanity and meet them where they are. The audience watched in silence, and many of them wept. Because they understood what Jake had learned through pain and purpose, that every child deserves to be heard, that every voice matters regardless of how it sounds, and that sometimes the people society dismisses as insignificant are actually the ones carrying the most important messages. Jake's hands formed one final sign, the same sign Sophia had given him in her last moments. Love. Because in the end, that was what everything came down to. Not credentials or qualifications or professional status. Just love, patient and persistent and powerful enough to change lives one connection at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.